Welcome to the Inner West Library's youth program. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal and the Wangal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my deepest respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to any First Australians watching today. Today we have an excellent workshop from Will Kostakis, one of our Inner West local writing legends, and he's going to share some techniques with you. We've got all of Will's books in our libraries. Reserve one today. Enjoy!
Hi there, I'm Will Kostakis, the young adult author of The First Third, The Sidekicks and The Monuments duology. And today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about how much power you have over the reader as a writer. And to do that, I'm going to use poetry. Now, even though I love writing poetry myself privately, I've never published any of my poetry. So to start with, I'm going to show you this power that you have over the reader through one of my novels, in this case, The First Third, and then we're going to pivot into poetry. I'm going to take what we learned from that excerpt that I read and apply it to our work. All right, so a little bit of background information. This is the main character's best friend. His name is Styx, and this is his 18th birthday. It has landed on the 100th anniversary of the Titanic sinking, and so because he is super appropriate, he is throwing a Titanic-themed birthday party. So here it is. We're going to sort of get to know the sidekick character, and we're going to pause, talk about him a little bit, and then I'm going to show you what happens next. Sampling his drink for traces of bourbon, Styx's mum asked a steerage passenger if he'd seen me. I pulled back from the window and collided with a giant Chinese ornamental dragon. You see, Styx collected adventure memorabilia. It all started in year 9, when he'd woken up with a galvanised tin letterbox in his bed and no idea how it got there. As his nighttime outings became more frequent, his collection grew larger and more ambitious. It now boasted lawn ornaments, traffic cones, and a pair of golden arches from the roof of a certain fast food outlet. Every time he'd nick something, I'd been there. I'd been the one asking if he really needed a giant Chinese ornamental dragon. Yes, the answer was always yes. These acquisitions weren't random though. Each came at the end of something. The galvanised tin letterbox wasn't just a galvanised tin letterbox. It was Ed Belmore's party. It was Styx attempting 100 beer shots in 100 minutes, getting to 40 and needing me to carry him home. It was us passing a galvanised tin letterbox on the way and him insisting he had to have it. It was him waking up the next morning wondering why he was in bed with a letterbox and me having to explain the events of the night right back to him. It was a moment. And when you put all the moments together, the letterboxes, the speed limit signs and the condiment bottles, you got a sense of how chaotically awesome it was to have Styx as a best friend. He cleared his throat. You do know that when you tell the internet where you're hiding, it's pretty easy for people to track you down, right? Styx was standing in the doorway, his weight against a single titanium crutch. He wore a black tailcoat and pants, a white vest and bow ties, floaties on each arm and a snorkel around his neck. Well, your mum hasn't found me. I raised the sausage roll. You want? Sure. He held out his free hand. The pastry soared over his shoulder and landed a little way down the hall. You know, sometimes I really wonder why I'm friends with you. The letterbox, 40 shots, 47, thank you. 47 then. You threw it up in my hair. You were in the way. You made me give you a piggyback. Styx scrunched, his eyes closed. And so, in an instant, I have sort of created this character dynamic where you have sort of the main character, Billy. He's quite reserved. He's hiding away during his friend's 18th birthday party. And his friend is quite bombastic. He clearly has a drinking problem, or at least he has a, stealing problem when he drinks. And so you are introduced to him through all of the things that he has stolen and scattered around his bedroom. And so I've been quite purposeful here in painting him a certain way. And when I visit schools and I talk about this scene, I pause here and I often ask, describe Styx to me. And this is where you realize the power of a reader. You can write something, but a reader's mind can go absolutely everywhere. I have readers saying, oh, he's really lanky, that's why his nickname is Sticks. You have other kids who are like, nah, he's a jock, he's really sporty and muscly, and Sticks is an ironic nickname. And so without me having to do any work already, they have painted their own pictures in their minds. And so, and through his sort of rebellious streak and through his sort of thievery, we have this idea that he is, a bit rebellious. And we've built this idea of who he is. And I ask, how many of you would want to be friends with him? A lot of kids are like, oh, yeah, he sounds really, really fun. And about a handful of kids are like, no, too messy for me. That's not my style. Okay? And what I wanted to do was I wanted to give them space to get to know Sticks before I really properly introduced him. Let's go back. The letterbox, 40 shots. 47, thank you. 47 then. You threw it up in my hair. You're in the way. You made me give you a piggyback. Sticks scrunched his eyes closed. Well, I'm sorry some of us aren't as able-bodied as you. We had been friends since the very beginning. Buckley's College Orientation Day, December 1999. The graduating kindergarten put on a production of Chicken Little. A light morning tea followed, and parents mingled. I presume lots of mothers said, my so-and-so is very bright for his age, and lots of fathers exchanged looks that said, I need a drink. In the dying minutes, someone tapped the back of my shoe. I turned around. He had 4 legs, 2 of which were some kind of metal. He'd hit me with one by mistake. Sorry, he said. I wasn't bothered. He was already infinitely more interesting than the kid my parents were trying to set me up with. He had 4 legs. Are you a robot? I don't remember how I asked it, but I imagine my eyes were slightly narrowed as I was equal parts excited and nervous to meet a real-life C-3PO. He shook his head, his blonde bowl cut moving with a 2-second time delay. Then what are they? I asked, pointing at his navy blue forearm crutches. My legs won't listen, he said. I stared at them for a moment. They bent out after the knee. Cool. He was Lucas until high school, but by then he'd caught on to the fact that cerebral palsy made people uncomfortable, so he rebranded himself like a shamed corporation after a PR crisis. When people asked what he had, he called it CP. When they asked his name, he called himself Sticks. We'd been friends long enough to catch each other's bad habits. When he started biting his nails, his mum blamed me. And when I started cocking my eyebrows in photos, my mum blamed him. We weren't the exact same person. He was 3 times 4 and I was 2 times 6. We both equaled 12. We were just made of different parts. And so what I wanted to do there was I wanted to not only extend their closeness, I wanted people to realize that all of their judgments about him were likely wrong. And the way that I did that was by disguising his disability, at least when you first met him. And now his disability is not something to be ashamed of, and it is something he is quite comfortable with. But he is very aware that other people are not as comfortable as he is. And his arc is about finding his place in, a Sydney scene that is quite obsessed with image and one particular idea of what a man is. And so I never hid his disability in the beginning, but if we go back to that part where I describe what he's wearing, Sticks was standing in the doorway, his weight against a single titanium crutch. I told the reader straight away, but then I obfuscated that. And so I continued with, he wore a black tailcoat and pants, a white vest and bow tie. And so I covered him up in the costume he was wearing, so people sort of didn't pay that much attention to his disability. And that was really important to me. And then when they met, I didn't let the 2 boys meet when they were older, and when Billy may have had his ideas of disability informed by society. Instead, they met at this really innocent time of their life when he saw Sticks and thought, oh my God, C-3PO, right? And so I wanted that childlike naivety, to be there, and I wanted them to see each other for who they were. And I wanted, in the same way, I wanted the reader to meet Sticks and not meet Sticks in that first page as a disabled person. Because, like it or not, people who don't have disabilities usually have prejudices that have been informed by the media that we produce and the media that we consume and the people that we talk to. And I wanted to take that away, and I wanted people to see him for who he was first. And that is a small sort of example of how then his arc extrapolates throughout the whole novel. And that sort of shows you how much power you have as a writer. It's not like a film where, if you saw that scene, you'd have to get in quite close to disguise the fact that Lucas was disabled until later on. But with writing, you choose what the audience sees. And, again, while I'm not going to say I am the greatest poet ever, poetry allows you to be quite purposeful with your language. And it forces you to be quite particular, especially if you're using an established form that has very restricted, beat counts on each line. Yeah. And so what I want to do is I want to show you the power that you have over a reader just using poetry. Okay? So, probably should have thought about this beforehand, but I'm going to write my first attempt at a poem, right? And I'm going to show you what my process is to make that poem better and to really think about what I'm writing down and what readers are getting out of it and what they can then build, in their own minds. All right. So to start with, I'm not going to use any particular form. I'm just going to say, look, let's say 10 beats per line, 10 syllables, right? And I'll do a few. If it rhymes, it rhymes. If it doesn't, I don't have the time. That's terrible. Okay, so let's pick a really random poem idea. Let's talk about going to the park, right? So 10 beats per line. There was a park near my house that I loved. Easy. There was a park near my house that I loved. Children were playing while adults lounged. Okay. Children played while adults lounged about. That should be 10 lines, 10 beats. There were laughs and shouts. I love these sort of accumulating lines where you can just do and this until you reach your beats. There were laughs and shouts and general cheer. Yes. That's not really grammatically correct, but let's go for it. Boy, did I love being here. That's 7 lines, but that's boy, did I love being here. Look, as a poem, kind of rubbish, right? You can see where I've tried to force the beats, adding a word like boy, no, terrible. So there was a park near my house that I loved, children playing while adults lounged about. There were laughs and shouts and general cheer. Boy, did I love being here. Okay? But you can see, even though the beats don't match up, adding in that rhyme gave it a sense of rhythm at the end. But look, grammatically, there's some messiness there, but we're just going to ignore that because that's not the point of this. The point of a first draft of a poem is to just get stuff down, get little images down, and you've got to find. My creative writing teacher in high school, shout out to Mrs. Mackenzie, she would always tell me that when you're writing poetry, it is like you are mining for a diamond, and you've got to go in and you've got to find that line that sparkles, and then you've got to pull it out and you've got to flesh that out. Other people call it sort of zooming in or funneling down. You are bringing your focus down to one particular point. This poem, while it's about a park, it is way too broad. And you don't get much detail. All you get is, children played while adults lounged about, right? There were laughs and shouts and general cheer. So while I don't think there's a line here that I think is quite exceptional that I want to pluck out, there is an idea that I like. I like the idea of sort of the adults lying in the sun while their kids, do whatever. So think about where your camera is. Yeah. And so what do I want to focus on? I'll focus on the adults, and I'm just going to talk about adults lying in the park. So at first, my focus was park, right? And I was thinking very specifically of a park on Sydenham Road that we used to go to as kids, right? But now I'm like, I'm going to zoom in, and I'm just going to zoom in on that one experience of two people lying together on the grass while children scream. Okay? I won't worry about beats this time because it's just a matter of getting something down. Their bodies close, the grass wet. They stared at the sky and imagined adventures in the clouds. He felt every breath she took, and he knew how her body tensed before she laughed. Okay, look, it's all right, whatever, I'll stop there. Okay, so right now, not a particularly great sort of poem. Again, we're dealing with first drafts here. We're not judging what we're writing. By all means, you can judge, leave hateful comments. I love it. Just picture me watching this video back and reading the comments, crying into a hot chocolate. But listen to this. Their bodies close, the grass wet. They stared at the sky and imagined adventures in the clouds. He felt every breath she took, and he knew how her body tensed before she laughed, right? So you've got these, do you see how our focus now that we've funneled down and it's just about two people lying in the grass? That's a better poem already because our focus is more specific, right? But if I went through this, now you might have a different answer to this. You might think that, the way, when you're lying next to someone and you can sort of feel how they feel just through, you can't even look at them. You can only sort of hear them sort of rustling in the grass, but you get a sense of what their body's doing. And you can write a whole poem about that if that's what interests you. But what's really jumping out to me, maybe it's because, I'm sort of big R romantic and I love, the idea of finding stories everywhere. I love that, imagined adventures in the clouds. That for me is the diamond line. The first draft didn't have a diamond line, this one does. So imagined adventures in the clouds, that for me, that would be the title of my poem. And now I would write a poem, a better one this time, about sort of looking at clouds, and it's quite an overcast day today, but you look carefully and it's like a magic eye. You start to see the lines and the contours of each cloud, and you basically see what you want to see in them. And you see all these stories, spread out, and playing out across the sky. And so I would write a poem about that. But do you see how where you decide to put your focus, that is where the power is. And that's when you can start to affect the reader, right? So we started quite far out if we thought of a camera in the park, right? It was an aerial view and you could see the whole park. I brought the camera in close and it instantly became more intimate. It instantly became more powerful. It started to stir stuff in us. Even though it wasn't a perfect poem, you were starting to get that sort of stirring feeling. And then the deeper you go into something, right? So the next one, where it could just be about one person looking at the sky, he could see sort of two clouds that start close together, but they get further and further away. What story is that telling? This guy is probably dealing with heartbreak or a loss of some kind. Yeah? And you can tell a poem about what he's feeling, but through what he sees in the clouds, if that makes sense. So be mindful of the power that you have when you're writing. Yeah? Be mindful of what it might make the reader feel. Yeah? I always say that as a writer, you have a reader in the palm of your hands. Yeah? You can just simply write something quite generic and plain. And that's fine. But often I find revisiting your work, zooming in, finding the emotions within it, and finding those moments that you can flesh out, whether in poetry or in fiction, those are the things that can have tremendous power. And those are, those are the stories that end up leaving a mark on the reader. So make of that what you will. Have a go at either doing that with your poetry, or even do that same diamond technique to the story that you've written, and ask yourself, when I'm describing something, have I zeroed in close enough? Yeah. And I hope it goes really well for you. Thanks so much for joining us. Happy writing.